My name is Luna. I'm 36 years old, and until recently, I would have described myself as a wife first, a strategist second, and a woman somewhere quietly in between. On the surface, my life looks steady. I live in Chicago. I work in operations consulting, one of those roles people don't fully understand but rely on when things begin to unravel. I am the person companies call when their systems are inefficient, when communication is fractured, when power is leaking in places no one wants to acknowledge. I sit in rooms, I observe patterns, and I fix what others overlooked. Ironically, I failed to apply that same precision to my own marriage. Most people who meet me think I'm gentle, composed, soft-spoken, the kind of woman who listens more than she talks. At social gatherings, I'm the one refilling glasses, remembering birthdays, and noticing when someone needs a quieter seat away from the noise. I have been called supportive more times than I can count. Reliable, calm, easy. What people rarely see is that calm is not passivity. It's a calculation. It's restraint. It's the discipline of not reacting when you're still collecting data. For years, I believed my marriage was built on partnership, mutual respect, shared ambition. I believed love was the foundation, steady, imperfect, but sincere. I told myself that differences in tone, in decision-making, in who took up more space in a room, those were normal variations between two adults building a life. But eventually, a sentence formed in my mind that I couldn't unhear. The moment I understood love was never the foundation of our marriage. Power was. It didn't arrive during a fight. There was no dramatic betrayal, no shattered glass, no screaming. It arrived quietly, like most truths do. It came after years of subtle patterns, after conversations that ended with me apologizing for things I didn't initiate, after achievements that somehow became threats. What I thought was a partnership turned out to be a silent competition. And the most unsettling part? Only one of us knew we were competing. This story is not about revenge. There is no explosive confrontation waiting at the end. There are no villains here. Only dynamics, blind spots, and choices. It's about the slow realization that being the stable one can sometimes mean being strategically underestimated. It's about what happens when a woman who has been quietly observing finally decides to stop explaining herself. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you how I moved from confusion to clarity, how silence transformed from survival to strategy, and how walking away from a power imbalance didn't require anger, only alignment. I won't dramatize what doesn't need drama. I won't exaggerate pain for effect. I will simply tell you what I saw once I allowed myself to see it clearly. Have you ever realized that what you thought was love was actually a negotiation you didn't know you were in? If you asked my husband how he would describe me during the first years of our marriage, he would probably smile before answering. Luna? She's steady. She keeps everything together. It always sounded like praise, and maybe at first it was. In our social circle, I was known as the composed one, the woman who never overreacted, the one who remembered to send thank you notes after dinner parties, the one who could calm a tense room with a single measured sentence. At his corporate events, I was introduced as my brilliant wife, said with a tone that felt affectionate, but faintly possessive. People would nod politely, ask me what I did, and then pivot the conversation back to him. His promotion, his next move, his ambitions. I didn't resent that. I understood how rooms worked. I knew hierarchy when I saw it. I had built my career analyzing it. What I didn't analyze, at least not yet, was the hierarchy forming inside my own home. At family gatherings, I became the logistics. I coordinated holidays, smoothed misunderstandings, and absorbed small tensions before they became visible. If his mother made a passive remark about my work hours, I laughed it off. If his friends joked that I was the serious one, I smiled and let the label stick. Serious, responsible, grounded. These were all flattering words for predictable. Predictable women don't threaten the balance of power. They stabilize it. In our marriage, I handled the systems, budgeting, scheduling, and long-term planning. He handled the spotlight, the public vision, the visible ambition. When we bought our apartment, I negotiated the price. He announced the news to our friends. When we discussed investments, I ran the numbers. He summarized the strategy over dinner. At the time, I told myself this was a division of labor, complementary strengths. And in some ways it was. But slowly, I began noticing something subtle. Whenever I excelled in a way that was visible, when a client publicly praised my restructuring plan, when my income surpassed his for a quarter, when I was invited to speak at a small industry panel, his tone shifted. Not dramatically, just slightly. He would congratulate me, but then add something like, "Just don't burn yourself out." Or, "That's impressive for consulting." Or my favorite, "You're good at the background stuff. That's rare." The background stuff. I smiled through it. I rationalized it. He didn't mean it that way, I told myself. I was the calm one, the stable one, the one who didn't need applause. And there was truth to that. I didn't crave attention. I never had. What I valued was competence, efficiency, integrity. But there is a difference between not needing applause and being consistently repositioned away from it. The more competent I became, the more I felt gently nudged back into containment. Not silenced, not openly dismissed, just reframed. If he made a bold decision at work, it was visionary. If I made a calculated decision, it was cautious. If he asserted himself in conversation, he was confident. If I corrected a factual error, I was intense. The language wasn't aggressive. It was subtle, almost invisible, which is why it took me so long to recognize the pattern. To everyone else, we looked balanced. Modern, equal, a power couple, someone once joked. But inside the relationship, the balance operated differently. He expanded. I adjusted. He occupied. I optimized around him. And because I never complained, because I never created drama, because I always understood, the dynamic calcified quietly. They saw me as the reliable axis around which everything turned. What they didn't realize was that even an axis, eventually, can decide to stop spinning. The first moment I remember clearly wasn't dramatic. It happened on a Thursday night in early spring. We were at a rooftop gathering hosted by one of his colleagues. Soft lighting, curated playlists, conversations that revolved around promotions and property investments. I had just finished explaining a restructuring project I was leading. It was complex. 3 departments, misaligned incentives, millions in operational leakage. I had spent weeks mapping behavioral patterns inside the company before presenting a solution. One of the senior managers leaned in. "That's impressive," he said. "How did you even spot that pattern?" Before I could answer, my husband laughed lightly and placed a hand at the small of my back. "She's always analyzing something," he said. "It's her thing. I tell her to relax sometimes." The group chuckled. It was subtle, harmless almost. But something about the phrasing shifted the energy. Not, "She's sharp." Not, "She saved them millions." Not even, "She's incredible at what she does." Just, "She overthinks." The conversation moved on quickly. Someone refilled glasses. Music shifted. The senior manager turned back to my husband and asked about his expansion plans. And I stood there, smiling. I told myself it was nothing. Except it wasn't the comment itself. It was the repositioning. The reframing. In one sentence, my competence became a personality quirk. My expertise became a mild eccentricity. On the drive home, he was relaxed, scrolling through his phone at red lights. "You were quiet after that," he said casually. "I was listening," I replied. "You know, you don't have to go so deep when people ask about work. It can make things intense." There it was again. Not wrong, not cruel, just corrective, as if my depth required moderation. I remember staring out the window at the city lights and feeling something small and unfamiliar. A tightening in my chest. Not anger, not even hurt. Recognition, because I had seen this pattern before, just not in my personal life. In consulting, when a team member subtly reframes another's expertise as overcomplicating, it's rarely about simplicity. It's about hierarchy. It's about preserving influence. You don't dismiss someone directly. You soften their authority, and you do it in front of witnesses. The next morning, I replayed the moment while making coffee. I told myself I was being overly sensitive, that marriages required adjustments, that maybe I did go too deep sometimes. But something in me logged the interaction anyway, not emotionally, structurally. I started noticing micro adjustments after that. When I disagreed with him in private, he'd respond with humor first. "Okay, strategist," he'd say. Or, "You and your spreadsheets." If I insisted on clarity, he'd sigh, not dramatically, just enough to signal inconvenience. When he explained his ideas, he expected full engagement. When I explained mine, he expected brevity. None of it was loud enough to confront. That's what made it effective. The world didn't see a power shift. They saw a charming couple with playful banter. But inside me, a quiet observation began forming. Every time I stepped slightly forward, I was gently nudged half a step back. Not by force, by tone. And tone is difficult to argue with. Because how do you protest something that can be dismissed as just joking? Weeks later, at another event, I intentionally simplified my explanation of a project. I kept it light, surface level. He smiled more that night, interrupted less. And that's when the second realization came. Not about him, about me. I was calibrating myself, adjusting my depth to maintain comfort, shrinking, not dramatically, but strategically, to avoid friction. It didn't feel like submission. It felt like maturity. At least, that's what I told myself. But somewhere beneath the surface, a question was beginning to take shape. If my full intelligence requires softening to preserve harmony, what exactly are we preserving? The strange thing about subtle disrespect is that it doesn't arrive labeled. It comes disguised as humor, as a concern, as helpful feedback. And if you are self-aware, if you are someone who constantly evaluates your own behavior, you will almost always turn inward first. After that rooftop evening, I didn't confront him. I recalibrated myself. At dinners, I shortened my answers. In group conversations, I let him finish thoughts that I could have completed more precisely. When he misrepresented something I had said earlier, I didn't correct him unless it was absolutely necessary. Not because I was afraid, because I wanted to be easy. That word, easy, became my silent metric. Was I being easy to love, easy to live with, easy to admire? And each time I chose restraint, the immediate reward was peace. He was warmer when I deferred, more affectionate when I didn't challenge his framing of events, more attentive when I stayed within the role he was comfortable with. I began to see the system clearly. The assertion created tension. Accommodation restored balance. So I told myself this was a compromise. Isn't that what long-term relationships require? Two people sanding down their sharper edges? But over time, the pattern deepened. If I corrected him privately about a financial detail, he'd respond with a faint defensiveness. I already handled it. If I suggested an alternative strategy for one of his business decisions, he'd say, "You don't have the full context." Once, when I mentioned that my firm was considering offering me an equity partnership track, he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's intense," he said. "Are you sure you want that kind of pressure?" Pressure. I had built my career under pressure. But in his framing, my ambition was a risk to our stability. His ambition, meanwhile, was a shared victory. I started minimizing good news. If a client extended my contract, I'd mention it casually. If my income spiked, I'd downplay it. If someone complimented my strategic insight in front of him, I'd pivot the credit. I wasn't consciously shrinking. I was preserving equilibrium. And because there were no explosive arguments, no raised voices, no obvious cruelty, I convinced myself this was a normal marital adjustment. The truth is, normalization doesn't require loud events. It requires repetition, repeated interruptions, repeated reframing, repeated microsignals that your full presence slightly destabilizes the dynamic. The turning point wasn't one major incident. It was the accumulation. One evening, we were reviewing our annual finances. I had prepared projections, contingency plans, and long-term investment strategies. It was something I enjoyed, mapping futures. He skimmed the spreadsheet and said lightly, "You really love controlling everything, don't you?" It was meant as a tease, but the word lingered. Controlling. I wasn't controlling outcomes. I was modeling probabilities. Yet somehow my precision became dominance in his narrative. And that's when a deeper awareness surfaced. He wasn't just reacting to my competence. He was repositioning it. If my strategic thinking could be framed as overthinking, if my planning could be framed as controlling, if my ambition could be framed as risky, then the hierarchy remained intact. Not because he declared it, because I participated in maintaining it. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me quiet, quieter than before, because I understood something essential. The dynamic wasn't accidental anymore. It was patterned, and patterns, once identified, can no longer be unseen. The question was no longer whether small cuts were happening. The question became, why was I still volunteering to bleed invisibly? There's a moment in every long relationship when you realize you are no longer being discovered. You are being assumed. It happened gradually. So gradually that I almost missed it. At some point, I stopped being Luna, the woman with layered opinions, quiet ambitions, complex emotional textures, and became something more functional. I became the stabilizer. If we hosted dinner, I orchestrated it. If a conflict surfaced between friends, I mediated it. If he felt uncertain about a career decision, I talked him through the logic until he felt solid again. And I did it well. So well, in fact, that it became expected. Reliability is seductive. When you consistently solve problems without complaint, people begin to believe that is simply who you are, an endless source of structure and calm. But structure without visibility slowly turns into infrastructure, and infrastructure is only noticed when it fails. I began to see how I was introduced in rooms. She's the organized one. She keeps us on track. She's good with details. Details, as if my insight were administrative, as if my mind were a tool instead of a force. The most telling moment came during a casual brunch with another couple. The conversation drifted toward long-term plans, children, relocations, risk. His friend asked, "So who's the risk taker in the relationship?" Without hesitation, my husband answered, "Definitely me." The table laughed lightly. I smiled too. But the truth was more complex. I wasn't reckless, but I wasn't afraid either. I had taken calculated career leaps before he ever considered leaving his first stable job. I had negotiated our mortgage terms aggressively. I had moved cities for an opportunity before he felt ready. Yet in the public narrative, I was cautious. He was courageous, and I let that narrative solidify, because correcting it would feel combative. That was the role I had unconsciously accepted. Support the story. Don't rewrite it. At home, it became even clearer. When decisions needed to be made, financial, logistical, strategic, he would ask for my input. And he valued it. He truly did. But once a decision was finalized, he presented it as his own. Not maliciously, not deliberately, just naturally. I noticed something subtle. He didn't experience my influence as shared leadership. He experienced it as support, and I had never challenged that framing. Why? Because somewhere in me lived an old emotional wound. The fear of being too much, too decisive, too analytical, too self-sufficient. Growing up, I learned that intelligence in women can unsettle fragile environments. So I mastered the art of dimming it slightly, just enough to be accepted, not enough to be threatening. In my marriage, that habit returned, not consciously, reflexively. I chose harmony over authorship. I chose subtlety over visibility. I told myself I didn't need credit, and that was true. But what I needed, what I hadn't articulated yet, was acknowledgement. Not applause, not validation, recognition of weight. The role I was assigned wasn't cruel. It was comfortable, reliable wife, strategic advisor, emotional regulator, useful, invisible. And the most dangerous part of invisibility isn't that others don't see you. It's that you slowly stop insisting on being seen. One night, after he fell asleep, I sat at our kitchen counter with my black leather notebook open. I began listing patterns, not grievances, not complaints, just observable dynamics. Who initiated big decisions? Who absorbed emotional tension? Who adjusted more frequently in public spaces? Who rephrased their opinions to soften the impact? The list wasn't accusatory. It was structural. And when I finished, I realized something steady and unsettling. I had not been diminished. I had been designated, assigned a role that made the system run smoothly. But systems are built on power distribution. And for the first time, I allowed myself to ask, who was benefiting most from mine? The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen during a betrayal. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was at home, working remotely. My laptop was open, spreadsheets layered across my screen, a pot of tea cooling beside me. He had taken the day off for a networking lunch, something he'd described as strategic positioning. Around 3 in the afternoon, I received an email. It was from a senior partner at my firm. Short, direct. They wanted to formally discuss offering me equity. Not a track, not a possibility. An offer. I read the message twice, then a third time. I didn't feel excitement first. I felt stillness. Equity meant ownership, voting power, influence over direction. It meant my strategic mind would no longer be hired temporarily, it would shape permanence. I closed my laptop and just sat there. In the past, this is the moment I would have called him immediately, shared it, framed it as ours. But something held me back. Not secrecy, just pause. I wanted to examine my reaction before placing it inside our dynamic. When he came home later that evening, he was energized from his lunch. He talked about potential collaborations, about how someone had described him as forward-thinking. I listened. Then I said calmly, "I received an offer today." He looked up. "Oh? They're offering me equity." There was a beat of silence, a microsecond. Then he smiled. "Wow, that's big." It was the right response, but I watched his eyes. There was calculation there. Quick, subtle, almost imperceptible. Not resentment, not even jealousy. Assessment. "What would that mean for your hours?" he asked. "More responsibility," I said, "but also more autonomy." He nodded slowly. "That's intense. It could really shift things." Shift things. The phrasing stayed with me. Not "that's incredible, you didn't earn that." It was framed as an impact, as a disruption. Later that night, as we lay in bed, he rolled toward me. "You know," he said softly, "we've always balanced each other well. I just don't want us to become competitive." The word landed quietly between us. Competitive. I hadn't introduced competition into the conversation. He had. And in that moment, clearer than any previous interaction, I understood something fundamental. He had been measuring us, not overtly, not maliciously, but internally, and my growth registered on his scale. That was the shift. Not anger, not confrontation, clarity. I realized that I had been operating under the assumption of partnership, while he had been unconsciously tracking positioning. Who earns more this quarter? Who commands more room attention? Who appears more essential? What I thought was a partnership turned out to be a silent competition, and only one of us had been unaware of it. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't reassure him either. I simply turned onto my back and stared at the ceiling, feeling something unfamiliar settle inside me. Detachment, not emotional withdrawal, not coldness. Perspective. For the first time, I stopped asking, "How do we protect harmony?" and started asking, "What dynamic have I been stabilizing?" The answer wasn't dramatic. It was structural. Love had existed, yes, but beneath it, woven quietly through decisions, tone, reactions, was power calibration. And that's when the sentence formed, clear and undeniable. The moment I understood love was never the foundation of our marriage. Power was. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I didn't plan. I simply knew that from this point forward, my silence would no longer be automatic. It would be chosen. After that night, nothing exploded. There was no visible rupture, no Cold War, no dramatic distance. From the outside, we looked the same, but internally, something fundamental had recalibrated. Before, my silence had been adaptive. I stayed quiet to maintain ease, to reduce friction, to protect what I believed was a partnership. Now my silence became observational, intentional. I stopped correcting small misrepresentations in public. Not because I was shrinking, but because I wanted to see how far the narrative would go without my participation. I stopped offering strategic advice unless explicitly asked. When he described our long-term plans to friends, I didn't refine his projections. I simply listened. And something interesting happened. He filled the space. Without my quiet structuring, his plans became broader, less precise, more ambitious in tone, less grounded in detail. At first, no one noticed. Then small cracks appeared. A timeline he'd announced didn't align with actual numbers. An investment he'd described as secured was still conditional. A collaboration he'd hinted at stalled quietly. Previously, I would have stepped in, adjusted language, clarified expectations, protected credibility. This time, I didn't. Not to embarrass him, not to prove a point, but to measure the system without my invisible scaffolding. At home, I shifted subtly too. I moved my financial projections into a separate folder. I updated my personal savings accounts independently. I reviewed our shared assets with fresh neutrality. Again, not emotionally, structurally. When he asked, "What do you think about this opportunity?" I responded with, "What do you think?" It unsettled him, not immediately, But gradually, he began seeking reassurance more directly. Does this make sense to you? You're quiet. Are you overanalyzing again? There it was, the old framing. But now I heard it differently. Overanalyzing was his word for when I saw further than he was comfortable with. So I answered calmly. I'm thinking. Nothing more. Silence, when it is no longer defensive, becomes power. And he mistook it for disengagement. One evening, he said, "You've been distant lately." I considered that carefully. "I've been listening," I replied. He studied me as if recalculating something, because what had shifted wasn't affection. I was still kind, still present, still steady. What had shifted was accessibility. I was no longer offering my internal processing freely, no longer smoothing preemptively, no longer adjusting tone to maintain ease. And without realizing it, he began working harder for reassurance. He complimented me more publicly, reached for my hand more often at events, mentioned my achievements more explicitly. It almost worked. Almost. But the difference now was that I could see the adjustment. And once you see calibration happening in real time, it's impossible to unsee. My silence had exposed something important. He was comfortable when my competence served his trajectory. He was unsettled when it stood independently. And I wasn't angry about that. I simply understood it. The quietest shifts are often the most irreversible. Because they don't demand reaction, they alter perception. By the end of that month, I felt something I hadn't felt in years inside my own marriage. Autonomy, not distance. Alignment. I wasn't shrinking anymore. I wasn't fighting either. I was observing and preparing, not for revenge, not for confrontation, but for clarity. Because once silence becomes a choice instead of a habit, you begin to realize how much noise you were previously absorbing. And I had absorbed enough. Preparation rarely looks dramatic. It looks like routine. That's why no one noticed when mine began. On the surface, I was still Luna, the calm wife, the strategist, the steady presence at dinner parties. I still remember birthdays, still sent thank you notes, still smiled at the right moments. But beneath that surface, I was running an audit. Not of him, of the system. I began with documentation. Not because I anticipated conflict, but because clarity requires records. I reviewed our joint accounts line by line. I mapped our shared assets against my individual contributions. I created projections. Best case, worst case, neutral scenario. I wasn't searching for wrongdoing. I was assessing independence. The difference is important. At work, I often told clients, if you want leverage, understand the numbers better than anyone else in the room. So I applied that principle quietly at home. I scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor under the pretense of long-term tax optimization. It wasn't a lie. It was simply incomplete. I asked precise questions. What does separation look like financially in Illinois? How are equity shares treated? What assets are considered joint by default? What protects individual ownership? The advisor answered clinically, no emotion, just frameworks. I left with information, not intention. That distinction mattered to me. At the same time, I accepted the equity offer, but I negotiated terms more assertively than I ever had before. Board influence, voting weight, protective clauses. I wasn't just securing income. I was securing a position. At home, I remained composed, affectionate, engaged. If he noticed I was working later some nights, he attributed it to new responsibilities. He didn't notice that I had opened a separate high-yield account. He didn't notice that I adjusted my direct deposit percentages. He didn't notice that I quietly removed my name from a liability guarantee tied to one of his speculative ventures. Because these were not confrontational acts. They were strategic alignments. The most powerful preparations are invisible because they don't require secrecy. They require patience. Meanwhile, I also began documenting tone, not to weaponize it, to ground myself. Each time, he reframed my ambition as risk. Each time, he positioned himself as the primary decision-maker in public. Each time, he subtly calibrated our narrative. I wrote it down. Patterns lose their gaslighting power when they are written in ink. And something fascinating happened as the weeks passed. The more independent I became internally, the less reactive I felt externally. His comments didn't sting the same way, because they no longer shaped my self-perception. They only revealed his. One evening at a networking event, he introduced me to a colleague and said, "She keeps me grounded." I smiled, and for the first time, I didn't feel reduced by it, because grounding no longer meant containment. It meant stability I owned. Later that night, I sat alone on our balcony, city lights flickering below. I realized something quiet and powerful. I was no longer trying to fix the dynamic. I was preparing to step outside it, not impulsively, not emotionally, deliberately. What they never noticed was that my silence had layers. Beneath the calm was calculation. Beneath the warmth was a boundary. Beneath the partnership was contingency. I wasn't building an exit out of anger. I was building optionality. And optionality is the beginning of power. Clarity rarely feels triumphant. It feels quiet. The private reveal didn't happen in a dramatic discovery. There were no hidden bank accounts, no secret messages, no explosive betrayals waiting to justify a clean narrative. What I uncovered was subtler, and in some ways more definitive. It began with a pattern I hadn't fully examined before. How he spoke about me when I wasn't the primary audience. At events, when he thought I was across the room. On phone calls, he took in the study with the door slightly ajar. In conversations with mutual friends, he assumed I was occupied. I didn't eavesdrop. I simply listened when proximity made it possible. And I heard the framing clearly. She's very methodical. She likes to plan everything. She's not big on risk. The words weren't negative, but they were narrowing. He described himself differently. I move fast. I trust instinct. I'm building something bigger. There it was again. The positioning. He wasn't diminishing me overtly. He was elevating himself comparatively. The more I listened, the clearer it became. In his narrative, I was the stabilizer to his ambition, the cautious counterweight to his courage. It wasn't malicious. It was identity management. And that's when the deeper realization surfaced. If he needed me to remain the grounded, predictable axis in order to sustain his image as bold and expansive, then my growth would always feel like a disruption to him. Because if I stepped fully into my scale, financially, strategically, publicly, his differentiation blurred. And in a dynamic built subtly on contrast, blur feels like a threat. That was the private reveal. Not that he was cruel, not that he didn't love me, but the architecture of our marriage required an imbalance to function comfortably for him. Love existed, but power distribution governed it. I confirmed this realization one evening without intending to. We were discussing a potential relocation opportunity for him. Another ambitious move. Another strategic expansion. He outlined his reasoning confidently. Then he paused. "What do you think?" he asked. I answered honestly, calmly. I presented a risk analysis, long-term sustainability factors, and potential blind spots. He listened. Then he said, half smiling, "You always find the cracks. Not you protect us, not you see what I miss. You find the cracks." As if clarity were an obstruction. In that moment, I didn't defend myself. I didn't soften the assessment. I simply said, "I see structures." And I watched something flicker behind his expression. Recognition. Because for the first time, I wasn't shrinking the truth to preserve comfort. I wasn't calibrating tone. I was standing in my full intellectual weight without apology. And the atmosphere shifted slightly. Not tense, just recalculated. Later that night, I opened my notebook and wrote a single sentence. He doesn't want a partner at full scale. He wants a stabilizer within range. That was the reveal. Not about him. About us. About the system we had unconsciously co-created. The most powerful leverage is not a secret document or a hidden account. It's understanding the architecture of the dynamic. Once you see the structure, you stop negotiating with emotion. You negotiate with reality. And reality told me something clear. If I continued to grow, and I would, the balance he was comfortable with would not survive unchanged. The only question left was whether I would dim myself to preserve it. For the first time, the answer felt simple. No. There's a misconception that life-altering decisions arrive with adrenaline. Mine arrived with paperwork. I sat at my desk one Saturday morning, sunlight stretching across the hardwood floors, my laptop open to two separate documents. One was the finalized equity agreement from my firm, carefully negotiated, legally dense, irrevocably binding once signed. The other was a consultation summary from an attorney I had met quietly 2 weeks earlier. The attorney hadn't asked dramatic questions. No raised eyebrows, no assumptions. She simply outlined options. Remain married and restructure financial boundaries. Negotiate a post-nuptial agreement clarifying asset separation. Or prepare for formal separation. 3 paths, all rational, all possible. only one irreversible. I wasn't reacting to cruelty. I wasn't fleeing betrayal. That would have been simpler. I was responding to architecture, to the realization that if I stayed within a dynamic built on subtle power calibration, my growth would always require negotiation. Not explicit negotiation, emotional negotiation, tone, timing, visibility, scale. And I no longer wanted to measure my expansion against someone else's comfort threshold. That morning, he was at the gym. Routine, predictable. I reviewed our financial breakdown again. Not because I doubted my analysis, but because I needed emotional certainty to match structural clarity. Could we repair the dynamic? Possibly. Through therapy. Through explicit conversations. Through redefining roles. But here's the truth I had quietly accepted. Repair requires mutual recognition of the imbalance. And he didn't see one. To him, we were stable, successful, balanced. Any attempt to reframe the foundation would sound like an accusation. And I didn't want to argue about gravity. I didn't want to explain to someone why standing at full height mattered to me. If I had to justify it, I would already be negotiating my scale. The attorney's final sentence during our meeting echoed in my mind. Sometimes the question isn't whether something is intolerable, it's whether it's aligned. That was the decision point. Not pain, alignment. Did I want a marriage where my power had to remain complementary? Or a life where my power could exist without calibration? I signed the equity agreement first. My hand didn't shake. Ownership, voting rights, structural influence. Then I opened a separate folder and finalized the documents initiating legal separation proceedings. Not filed yet, but prepared. There's a quiet strength in readiness. I wasn't choosing chaos. I was choosing inevitability. Because once I stepped fully into my professional scale, once my income trajectory and influence expanded publicly, the silent competition would intensify. And I refused to live inside an invisible scoreboard. When he came home later that afternoon, flushed from exertion, he kissed my forehead casually. "Productive morning?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. It was true. That night I lay beside him and felt no anger, no resentment, only certainty. I had chosen the irreversible path, not because I wanted distance, but because I wanted wholeness. Sometimes the most decisive moments in a life don't sound like thunder. They sound like a pen clicking closed. Once the decision was made, everything became procedural. There is something almost sacred about quiet execution. No declarations, no warnings, just steady movement. I didn't file immediately. I organized first. I separated my finances formally, rerouted income streams, confirmed individual asset protections, and updated beneficiary structures tied to my equity. Everything was done legally, transparently, calmly. I wasn't hiding money. I was clarifying ownership. I met with the attorney twice more, refining language. In Illinois, separation requires precision. Timing matters. Documentation matters more. Meanwhile, life at home looked unchanged. We still had dinner together most evenings. We still attended events. We still discussed schedules. But I no longer participated in long-term planning conversations as if they were shared by default. When he said, "In 5 years, when we expand," I didn't fill in the details. I let the sentence hang in the air. He began noticing that. "You've been very independent lately," he said one night. Not accusing, just observing. "I've always been independent," I replied gently. The difference now was that I wasn't masking it with constant reassurance. At work, my new equity position was announced internally. It wasn't a loud celebration, but it was visible. My name carried a different weight in meetings. Decisions required my vote. He congratulated me again, sincerely this time. But there was an undercurrent of recalibration in his tone. "So this changes your trajectory," he said. "Yes," I answered. He nodded slowly, as if remapping our shared future in his mind. What he didn't know was that I had already remapped mine. I also did something small but symbolic. I rented a private office space 3 days a week instead of working primarily from home. It made sense professionally. It also created distance structurally. When you begin untangling a life, you don't rip threads. You loosen them. He interpreted the shift as ambition, drive, focus. He didn't see it as preparation. There were no dramatic scenes, no suspicion, because I hadn't changed emotionally. I hadn't withdrawn affection. I hadn't become cold. I had simply stopped overextending. And without my constant calibration, subtle imbalances became more visible. He mismanaged a timeline publicly and asked me later, "Why didn't you catch that?" "Because I'm not stabilizing the narrative anymore," I thought. Instead, I said calmly, "I assumed you had it handled." Silence again. Not sharp, just firm. The attorney called me one Thursday afternoon. "We're ready whenever you are," she said. I looked out the window of my office, watching the city move beneath me. Cars, people, lives intersecting and diverging without spectacle. "I'll let you know," I replied. And I meant it, because even now I wasn't acting from urgency. I was acting from inevitability. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about dignity. No ultimatums, no emotional leverage, no threats designed to provoke fear, just clarity unfolding. By the end of that month, every document was prepared. Every account was aligned. Every projection accounted for. Nothing explosive had happened, and yet everything had shifted. He still believed we were balancing. I knew we were concluding. The consequences didn't begin with paperwork. They began with absence. Not physical absence, structural absence. When you quietly remove your stabilizing force from a dynamic, the imbalance doesn't collapse immediately. It wobbles first. He began noticing small disruptions. A dinner invitation was double booked because I didn't cross-check his calendar. A payment was scheduled later than expected because I didn't preemptively remind him. A conversation at an event where he overstated a projection, and no one corrected it. None of these were catastrophic, but they accumulated. One evening, after a networking function, he exhaled heavily in the car. "That felt off," he said. "In what way?" I asked calmly. "I don't know. The energy was strange." I knew exactly what it was. He had introduced a future partnership as finalized. It wasn't. One of the investors had gently clarified that discussions were still ongoing. Previously, I would have adjusted the framing mid-conversation, subtly redirecting language to protect credibility. This time I let him speak, and reality corrected itself. At home, he began seeking my reassurance more explicitly. "Do you think I handled that well? Was that too ambitious? Be honest." I was honest, measured, neutral. "You might want to clarify timelines next time." No softening, no overcompensation. He studied me as if trying to detect something beneath my tone. "You've changed," he said one night, not angrily, just quietly. "I've grown," I replied. That unsettled him more than an accusation would have, because growth implies divergence. Meanwhile, my professional world expanded. My name appeared on internal strategy documents. My input shaped quarterly decisions. I was invited into conversations that previously excluded me. He noticed the shift in how I carried myself. Not arrogance, gravity. When you no longer seek approval, your posture changes without you trying. Friends began asking me directly about my work rather than through him. Invitations arrived addressed solely to me. He smiled through it. But at home, subtle tension surfaced. "Do you need to attend every one of these?" he asked once, referring to a board dinner. "Yes," I answered simply. The conversation ended there. The most telling consequence wasn't logistical. It was emotional. He began trying to reassert narrative balance. At gatherings, he praised me more publicly, mentioned my equity position, highlighted my discipline. It was almost generous. But I recognized it. Recalibration. When imbalance threatens comfort, the instinct is to restore it. The problem was that the original balance had depended on my containment, and I was no longer contained. The absence of my quiet adjustments created space, and space reveals structure. One night, as we prepared for bed, he said softly, "It feels like you don't need me the way you used to." The sentence hung in the dim light. I turned toward him, studying his face. "I never needed you less," I said carefully. "I just stopped shrinking." He didn't respond, because shrinking had been invisible to him, and its absence felt like a loss. That was when I understood the real consequence. When power dynamics shift, the person who benefited from the previous balance experiences it as deprivation, not because something was taken, because something stopped being given. And I had stopped giving quite diminishment. The wobble had begun. The structure hadn't fallen yet, but it no longer stood on unquestioned ground. The moment he realized something was truly wrong didn't come from a fight. It came from a question he asked one Sunday morning. We were sitting at the kitchen island. Coffee between us. Sunlight filtering through the windows in that deceptively peaceful way weekends have. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "Are you happy?" It wasn't casual. It wasn't rhetorical. It was careful. And for the first time in years, I didn't rush to protect the atmosphere. "I'm clear," I said. He frowned slightly. "That's not what I asked." "I know." Silence settled between us. Not hostile, just heavy. He leaned back in his chair. I feel like I'm losing you. There it was. Not anger, not an accusation. Fear. And for a brief second, something inside me softened. Because he wasn't a villain. He wasn't cruel. He was a man who had grown comfortable inside a dynamic that quietly favored him. And now the ground felt unstable. You're not losing me, I said gently. You're just not defining me anymore. He stared at me as if trying to decode a language he'd never had to learn. I don't understand what changed, he said. And that was the most honest part of it. He truly didn't. Because from his perspective, we had been successful, functional, admired. There had been no dramatic betrayal to signal a crisis, only a slow shift in posture. I think we've been balancing something that wasn't equal, I said calmly. He shook his head almost immediately. That's not fair. I've always supported you. I know, and I've never tried to compete with you. The word again. Compete. He didn't see it because competition, when subtle, feels like normal ambition. It wasn't intentional, I said. But it was there. He ran a hand through his hair, agitation rising. Not loud, just tight. So what are you saying? That I'm insecure? That I can't handle your success? I'm saying, I replied evenly, that our dynamic required me to stay slightly smaller for it to feel comfortable. The room went very still. That's not true, he said quickly. But it lacked conviction, because somewhere, even if faintly, he recognized the pattern. Over the next week, he tried to fix it. He initiated conversations about shared leadership, suggested couples therapy, spoke about redefining roles. All reasonable, all mature. If this had happened a year earlier, I might have said yes. But here's what he didn't understand. I wasn't leaving because he was incapable of growth. I was leaving because I no longer wanted to negotiate my expansion. Repair would still require discussion of scale, of ego, of positioning, and I was tired of translating my size into something digestible. One evening, as we sat on opposite ends of the couch, he asked quietly, "Is there someone else?" "No," I said immediately. "Then why does this feel so final?" Because clarity doesn't reverse. Because once you see the architecture, you can't pretend the walls are decorative. But I didn't say that. Instead, I said, because I already made the decision internally. He looked at me then, not angry, not defensive, just stunned. That's when panic surfaced. Not dramatic, but deep. He began listing memories. Trips, milestones. The early years when everything felt easy. "I love you," he said, as if the statement alone could restore foundation. I believed him. And that was the tragedy. Love had existed, but love alone hadn't structured the marriage. Power had, and once I stepped fully into mine, the old structure could not hold. It wasn't explosive. It was irreversible. The actual conversation, the one that formalized everything, was almost clinical. No raised voices, no slammed doors, no accusations thrown like weapons. We sat across from each other at the dining table one Tuesday evening. The same table where we had once mapped vacations, investments, and 5-year plans. Now there were documents between us, not aggressively placed, just present. He looked at the folder for a long time before opening it. "So this is real," he said quietly. "Yes." He flipped through the first few pages, legal language reflecting softly in his eyes. "You've already spoken to an attorney?" "Yes." "How long?" "A few weeks." That seemed to hurt more than the documents themselves. Not because I had betrayed him, but because I had moved without announcing it. "You didn't think we could fix this?" The question wasn't angry, it was searching. "I think we could adjust behaviors," I said calmly. "But I don't think we could dismantle the foundation." "And what foundation is that?" "The one where my scale had to stay slightly negotiable." He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "I never asked you to be smaller. You didn't have to." That was the heart of it. Power dynamics don't require explicit instructions. They require comfort zones. "And you never told me you felt that way," he said. "I didn't understand it fully until recently." Silence again. He closed the folder. "So this is it? After everything? After years?" There was no bitterness in his tone, only disbelief. "This is alignment," I said gently, "not punishment." He shook his head slightly. "It feels like I'm being punished for something I didn't even know I was doing." "I know." That was what made it heavy. If he had been cruel, this would have been simpler. If he had betrayed me, this would have been clearer. But the truth was quieter. We had built a marriage that functioned beautifully, as long as I calibrated my expansion. And I had stopped calibrating. "I love you," he said again, softer this time. I know. Then why isn't that enough? Because love had been intertwined with positioning, with subtle competition, with narrative management. Because I no longer wanted to be admired in contrast to him. I wanted to exist without comparison. But I didn't need to say all of that. Instead, I said, love isn't supposed to require containment. That was the only line that carried weight. He didn't argue with it. He didn't raise his voice. He just sat there, absorbing it. For the first time, I saw him not as an opponent in a silent competition, but as a man confronting a mirror he had never needed to look into before. And I felt no triumph, only calm. The confrontation ended without drama. We discussed timelines, logistics, living arrangements. Practicality can be merciful. As he stood up from the table, he paused. I wish you had told me sooner. I met his eyes. I wish I had understood sooner. That was the closest we came to shared regret. No explosions, no humiliation. Just the quiet ending of a structure that could not evolve without someone shrinking. And I had decided that someone would no longer be me. The first night alone in my new apartment was quieter than I expected. No dramatic loneliness, no cinematic breakdown, just stillness. Boxes stacked neatly against the wall. A single lamp casting warm light across an otherwise minimal room. My black leather notebook was resting on the kitchen counter like it always had. Only now, it belonged entirely to my space. I stood by the window overlooking the city and waited to feel something sharp. Instead, I felt expansion, not relief, not victory. Expansion. For years, I had been measured in relation to someone else. Supportive, grounding, stabilizing. Even my strengths had been contextual. Valuable because they balanced him. Impressive because they contrasted him. Now there was no contrast, no narrative to calibrate, just scale. In the weeks that followed, I noticed subtle shifts in myself. I spoke without a pre-editing tone. I accepted invitations without cross-checking the emotional impact. I worked late when necessary without framing it as temporary intensity. My ambition no longer required reassurance. At work, my presence deepened. Not louder, just heavier. I didn't hesitate before challenging projections. I didn't soften my conclusions. And something interesting happened. No one perceived me as aggressive. They perceived me as certain. The fear I had carried for years, that standing fully in my intelligence would alienate, dissolved quietly. Because the only place it had truly been negotiated was inside that marriage. Friends asked how I was doing. Calm, I would say. And I meant it. There was no bitterness toward him. No late-night anger replaying old conversations. I didn't see him as a villain in hindsight. I saw him as someone comfortable inside a structure that had worked for him. And I saw myself as someone who had outgrown it. Growth doesn't always require conflict. Sometimes it requires a departure. I began rebuilding my routines deliberately. Morning coffee alone. Board meetings without emotional recalibration afterward. Evenings where silence felt expansive instead of tense. I invested more, financially and personally, into projects that carried my name alone. Ownership changed how I moved, not because I needed to prove anything, but because there was no longer a hidden scoreboard in the room. I stopped measuring my success against anyone's comfort. And the most surprising shift was internal. I didn't feel stronger. I felt uncontained. Strength implies resistance. Uncontained implies freedom. The narrative I once lived inside, steady wife, grounding presence, quiet stabilizer, wasn't false. It was incomplete. I am still steady, still strategic, still calm. But now those qualities orbit me, not someone else. The woman I am now isn't louder. She's clearer. She doesn't shrink to preserve harmony. She doesn't escalate to assert power. She simply stands at full height and lets the structure adjust or fall around her. And if I'm honest, the most profound realization wasn't about him. It was about me. I had never lacked power. I had only been negotiating its visibility. Not anymore. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, you might be waiting for a final twist. A betrayal exposed. A regret confessed. A dramatic reconciliation. There isn't one. There was no villain, no explosive collapse, just a quiet understanding that love, when intertwined with unspoken power dynamics, slowly turns into negotiation. And negotiation, if one person is always adjusting the scale, becomes eroded. The most important sentence I've learned to say is this: containment is not a compromise. Compromise is mutual. Containment is unilateral. For years, I believed I was being mature, flexible, emotionally intelligent. And I was. But maturity without self-visibility becomes self-erasure. What I thought was a partnership turned out to be a silent competition. Not because he declared it, but because the structure rewarded comparison. And the moment I understood that love was never the foundation of our marriage, power was, I stopped trying to win. I chose to leave the game entirely, not in anger, not in revenge, in clarity. Here's the truth no one says out loud. You can love someone deeply and still outgrow the dynamic you built together. You can acknowledge their humanity and still walk away. You can end something peacefully and still mean it permanently. The quietest decisions are often the most irreversible because they are not reactions. They are recognitions. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this. Pay attention to where you are calibrating your size. Not because someone told you to shrink, but because the system feels smoother when you do. Ask yourself gently, are you compromising or are you containing? And if you stood at full height, financially, emotionally, intellectually, would the relationship still feel aligned? I'm not here to tell you what to do, only to tell you what I finally understood. So now I'll leave you with one question. Have you ever mistaken balance for equality and realized too late that you were the one adjusting all along? If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts below. I read every comment. And sometimes, clarity begins with someone else's courage to speak it.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.